Good evening. My name is Joy Armstrong, and I am the director and curator of the Galleries of Contemporary Art. Thank you. Thank you. And we are just so excited to present this production of The Butterfly Effect this evening, which is part of our current exhibition called We Are the Sky, which is on view now through Saturday, October 5th. We would like to thank the El Pomar Foundation, the September 7th Fund, founded by Ben and Raynell Kuckel, the Janine Sheehy Memorial Fund, UCCS Student Government, and the generous members of our Curators Circle. GOCA, if you weren't aware, fundraises 100% of our program and exhibition costs, so the financial support we receive from these amazing folks make all of this possible. At this time, if you haven't done so already, we ask you to silence or power off all of your electronic devices. It's quiet so far. And please, we ask no flash photography this evening. So, by way of introduction, Emmy Award-winning artist Karen Mosbacher's multidisciplinary practice focuses on painting, mixed media, sculpture, installation, and performance, and she is celebrated for the synesthetic qualities in her work. Karen currently exhibits at the Auric Gallery and Platt Collections in Colorado Springs, as well as at galleries in Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Santa Fe, Chicago, and Oklahoma City. She lives and works in Colorado Springs with her canine studio assistant, Ruby. Please join me in welcoming Karen Mosbacher and this brilliant cast of The Butterfly Effect.
No crying today, for me. Welcome, and thank you for coming. The world premiere of The Butterfly Effect, Experimenting with Expression, is a dream come true for me. For several years, I have dreamed about dancers painting music, painting the music that I see. I'm very happy that you're here to share these moments with me. First, I want to thank so many for the tremendous support we have received during this incredible and very experimental project. I'll begin with our deep gratitude to the Colorado College Cultural Attractions Fund for their wonderful financial assistance, the Purple Mountain Group at Morgan Stanley, and their support for our dancers, Haley Pigford, and the RE/MAX Black Belt brokerage team for raising funds for our last-minute necessities. A huge thanks to all our in-kind donors, and a special thanks to Dave and Christina from the Optical Alchemist, Bobby Hughes, and a very special thanks to Max Morgan, our wonderful engineer who made this set possible. We wouldn't be here presenting this We Are the Sky program without the magnificent people of the Ent Center for the Arts and the Galleries of Contemporary Art. I have deep gratitude toward these people, and they have helped us tremendously. Joy Armstrong, director, you just met her, Lene Cravens, exhibitions and events manager, Bess Cesiri, production manager, and of course, David Siegel, our executive director. Most importantly, I want to thank Ofer Ben-Amots and Janet Johnson for being marvelous collaborators in this fantastic story. This story begins with music. Pondering on the perfect symmetry of the butterfly versus the exponential spread of the pandemic, Ben-Amots based the music on the Fibonacci numerical series and found a musical way to connect the golden ratio with the chaos theory. This piece is inspired and informed by the Fibonacci series while describing the concept of the butterfly effect. The Fibonacci series, this is for all you students out there, listen up, is integrated into all the aspects of the composition: the melodic motivic patterns, meter signatures and tempo indications, the number of notes in a pattern, and the number of measures. The result is a musical story of great desperation turning into hope. Finally, when you hear the music, don't look for the Fibonacci series or other mathematical aspects. After all, this is a piece of music, not math. Ofer, would you stand up so we can recognize you? And now it is my great pleasure to present to you a Grammy-nominated pianist and Steinway artist, Susan Grace, performing Ofer's composition, The Butterfly Effect. Next, please welcome our Professor of Physics from Colorado College, Shane Burns, with his presentation, The Symphony of Chaos.
Good evening. Well, my goal here tonight is to try to help you understand what the butterfly effect is and how it's related to chaos, and what chaos actually is. The butterfly effect was discovered when someone was studying the weather and discovered this interesting effect where chaos was produced, but he was studying a physical system. So that means if we really want to understand the butterfly effect, we have to understand a little physics, okay? So I'm going to talk about some physics tonight. I promise there's not a single equation in my presentation. So the goal of physics is really about predicting the future. For example, if I had a baseball and I go out in the parking lot of the Ent Center, and if I stand at a particular place and I throw that baseball with a certain speed, and I know the speed that I throw it with at a certain direction, I can predict precisely where it's going to land. In fact, I can predict the entire trajectory. But I need two things. I need the laws of physics, which for a baseball are well understood. In fact, all of the physics tonight that I'm going to talk about, the laws of physics are very well understood. But the other thing I need are the initial conditions, the starting point for this motion. So another example is I will make a prediction based on the laws of physics and knowing the initial conditions of the position of Saturn a month ago, that if you go out tonight about midnight, look in the south a little bit to the east and about 40 degrees up from the horizon, you'll see a bright object, and that bright object is Saturn. How do we know that? Because we know the initial conditions, where Saturn was a few months ago, and we know the laws of physics. All of that is really well understood. If I made a small error, and it's impossible to not make a small error in determining the initial position of Saturn in the night sky a month ago, my observations tonight, or my prediction tonight, would be a little bit off. Might be 41.5 degrees or something. That's normal, ordinary systems. The problem is there are some systems for which a small change can make dramatic effects. So that's what I want to illustrate. And I'm going to do that with a little simulation. We'll start out with a very simple simulation. This is just a mass hanging on the end of a rigid rod with a pivot up here. And I bet without any physics, you can all predict what's going to happen if I pull this up to about 10 degrees and let it go. Think about it. What's going to happen? Yeah, it's going to swing back and forth in a pretty predictable way. The initial condition is 10 degrees, and it's starting at rest. Those are the starting points. And if I start the motion, of course, it does kind of what we expect. But now, let's see what happens if we change the initial conditions a little bit. So I'm going to put the blue bob at 10 degrees, and this red one, 12 degrees, say. Very close together. What do you think is going to happen when I let it go? Well, pretty much the same thing, and in fact, just making that small change of about 2 degrees didn't make much of a change in the motion. But if I make the system just a little bit more complicated, the whole program gets more complicated. So here I have now two masses. Let me scroll this down so you can see a little bit better. The blue one I know is a little bit hard to see, but this is the best animation I could find. So the red one, both of them, consist of a pivot up here and a single mass here, another pivot there, and another mass down here. And I'm going to start this first set of masses up here at about 10 degrees, and we're going to let it go. What's going to happen? Yeah, it's going to swing back and forth, kind of in the same way. It's a little bit more complicated, perhaps, because there's two masses, so they wobble around a little bit differently, but it's pretty much the same. Now I'm going to compare that with another bob that I'm going to put here at, let's say, 11 degrees. So I've got both of the pendulums here, but one is starting at a slightly different position. What do you suppose is going to happen? Yeah, pretty much the same thing. Okay, they're going to oscillate, and they track each other pretty well. So if I made a small error in the measurement of the initial conditions for this system in this configuration, we would have no problem. But let's make things a little more extreme. I'm going to put one of the bobs up here at 171 degrees, and this one at 170 degrees. Okay. So that puts them in sort of a funny position. They're both, the masses are up above the pivot, but they're connected by rigid rods, remember? And we're going to let it go. Remember, this is all completely deterministic. Sometimes people confuse randomness with chaos. They're two distinct things. This system is, well, I won't tell you. It's going to exhibit chaos, okay? But it's not random. It's completely deterministic. But I've started with slightly different initial conditions. So you want to see what's going on? Have I built the suspense enough? Okay. All right. Okay, they start out together, and then pretty soon, everything goes crazy, and the motion is truly chaotic. In fact, in this system, I believe for these conditions, the system never repeats itself. It just keeps doing sort of what looks to be random things, but again, it's completely deterministic. But you can see that that is going to raise a big problem for physics. If physics is about predicting the future, that means that I have to know the initial conditions exactly if it's a chaotic system, or I'm going to get completely different behavior. So that's where the term, the butterfly effect, comes from. It was coined by this fellow by the name of Edward Lorenz. He was studying weather, and he noticed in his computer modeling that sometimes with slightly different initial conditions, he would have completely different weather. Okay, why was that? And then it was discovered that, yeah, this is the onset of what we call chaos. So he coined the term the butterfly effect. I don't think he actually called it the butterfly effect, but it comes from this quote by Lawrence. He said, "When a butterfly flutters its wings in one part of the world, it can eventually cause a hurricane in another." So this is sort of a illustration of that. In Brazil, a butterfly flutters its wings. If it moves its wings one way, maybe we'll have a nice day in Texas the next day. If it flutters its wings slightly differently, we may have a tornado in Texas. And it can't be predicted because you can never know precisely what the motion is that that butterfly produced. So that's the butterfly effect from the point of view of a physicist, and now you're all physicists.
Now for the rest of the story. 2 years ago, when Ofer put together the first butterfly effect presentation, we had similar presenters to include physics, math, a redacted poem, and a wonderful story. And when Susan Grace played the butterfly effect piano music, I was honored to paint live on the stage with her. While I'm not painting tonight, the surprise that is coming soon is my vision. A colossal amount of hard work done by many people brought us all to this place. Now let's welcome the program director for Classical 88.7, KCME, the host of Composers a la carte, Robert Bruce, reciting a very unusual poem, Chaos.
Good evening. Ben-Amots wrote a very intriguing and thoughtful and somewhat humorous article about chaos theory, about its creation and about its application, interpretation, and use in time travel fiction. He redacted that poem using the Fibonacci sequence, something I'll let the mathematician talk about because I have no idea what it is. It's resulted in this poem called Chaos. I predict a rounding error into being. Lorenz's weather model, a set of warmer, even to know the present, if we are anyway, if in of in may be. Hard to misinterpret. Make it easy to misinterpret. Giving the butterfly, does flap a tornado? That a computer, the analogy, a human error, Great Lorenz seems to be small, impact that it could know. Lorenz had no time, care more, and something, small term. Even to factors confirm, predict, faith term models. Speech, in a way, butterfly itself, effect. One error, though humble, it's been any study forever. The Ashton-Kutcher reference culture. They be and deal in, sure, why not? Time travel fiction has any change equals chaos. Turn, reframe predictions. Facts that are accelerating, shooting time for global economics. Eye to basics. Chaos concept. Hence, Lorenz's factors, fractional dimensionalities, are tiny individual roots, the larger pattern of eye to basics. That chaos measures forward, backward. That chaos, as time, it worked. Decrease points, the past is the end. Chaos would be linear. Eye to basics. We too buy it. The events. Chernobyl, not buy off half a million years, to set my alarm, to cause and effect. Our no will only. Precise we, our information. Example, people. Out, or seemingly in, we cannot weather. But worked a local newsroom, pretty, whatever. The 7-day report is as accurate as we need it to be. Too far into, I'm myself. That's Jurassic Park. He's the butterfly. But I also could have predicted that.
Good evening. I'm going to offer the mathematician's perspective in contrast to or complementary to the physicist's interpretation, and perhaps you will all be mathematicians in a short time. I can't promise no equations. I believe I have 3. So an overview, the Fibonacci numbers are connected, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. They are connected to a very special number called the golden ratio. Both the Fibonacci numbers and the golden ratio appear in many ways in our world. We come to this topic through a population model of a merchant mathematician from almost a millennium in the past, and for whom the Fibonacci numbers are named. A different population model called the logistic model will show us a route to the mathematical chaos that we discussed earlier, that Dr. Burns discussed earlier, and we will then encounter the Feigenbaum constant and fractals along the way. Finally, the Fibonacci numbers will make an unexpected return. So in his population model, this is from Fibonacci in the 1100s, Fibonacci wanted to consider starting with a pair of baby rabbits and wanted to know what would happen after 1 year to the population if they were to reproduce every month, with the proviso that the bunnies need to mature for a month before producing offspring, and we also assume no bunnies die within that year. So Fibonacci asked what would the population be after a year, starting with just one pair of baby rabbits. Let's explore that. So we begin with our one pair, and in the second month, on the second row here, there is still just one pair of baby bunnies, now a little older, maturing. And then in the third month, the bunnies are mature enough to produce offspring, and so we have a total of 2 bunnies. After one more month, the now mature bunnies have, let's see, the offspring that are mature will, there are 2, right, the original pair reproduces again while their first offspring mature. And in the next month, on the second to last row, there are 2 new pairs of babies, and in addition to the existing 3, so that makes a total of 5. Here's a new baby pair, here's a new baby pair. And at each stage, we have the previous month's bunny pairs, that's with the straight line going down just from one month to the next, and we can ask, and some new babies arrive. So we can ask how many. Well, at each stage, the new offspring come from the rabbit pairs who are mature, and that's exactly the number of rabbit pairs 2 months back. So if I want to see the new bunny rabbits in this last generation, I look 2 months back and see all of these bunnies. They will now be mature. They will mature and produce babies, and so we get to 8 bunnies. So we've added, to get these 8, we've added the past 2 months' population. And this is how the Fibonacci numbers are formed. The population from one generation to the next, we have 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. Each number is obtained by adding the previous 2 numbers. And the rule, and we've got here's my first equation. The rule says to get the next generation, just add the previous 2 generations. So Fn is the number of bunnies. And we can answer Fibonacci's question: how many bunnies? What is the bunny population after 1 year, 12 months? That's the 144, the 12th Fibonacci number, indicated by F12 here. And is that 144 bunnies? Quick test. Those were pairs. So there's actually 288 bunnies, but I won't trouble you with too much more arithmetic besides that. If the bunnies were to continue, this sequence actually grows quite rapidly. If the bunnies were to continue for 2 years, so after 24 months, we would actually have 46,000 pairs of rabbits. So this model predicts a population explosion, but realistic or not, as this model may, represent a real bunny population or not, it does explain what the Fibonacci numbers are, and it is quite widely known that these numbers appear frequently in nature. So my first example is a pineapple, and we can, if we count the number of spirals in a pineapple, and there's different ways to do this. I've indicated 2 ways to do this. There are several spirals laid out on the surface of the pineapple. It's a little hard to see, and you have to go around the back to really see what's happening. But there will be either 8 or 5, or typically 8 or 5 or 13 spirals. And I'll let you take a look at a real pineapple afterwards to count that. Yes, so they also appear in pine cones. So here's a typical pine cone, and the green spirals here are bending clockwise, and there are 8 of those. And we can also count a different arrangement of the spirals that are bending in the counterclockwise direction, and there are 13 of those in this particular pine cone. We also see these in sunflowers, and there's many, many spirals here. In this particular sunflower, we have the 8th and 9th Fibonacci numbers appear. That's 21 and 34. So 21 curves are spiraling counterclockwise, and 34 are spiraling clockwise. So the Fibonacci numbers are connected to another special number called the golden ratio, or golden section, where the larger the numbers get, the closer we get to the golden section. So to see this, we take ratios of successive Fibonacci numbers. So the larger to the smaller, 2 divided by 1, 3 divided by 2, 5 divided by 3. And the decimal approximation gets closer and closer to a very special number called the golden ratio, 1.6180339. And this, we get greater accuracy to that number as we go further out in the sequence. And many books have been written on the golden ratio and in connecting concepts in mathematics and in nature. But now we're going to change gears and look at a different population model. So here's my second equation. So this is it's called the logistic model for obscure reasons. And it's used by biologists to model many different species. And in this case, the population has a limited size, quite different from the Fibonacci's bunnies, who were certainly not limited in size. We have a maximum carrying capacity of this population of 100%, and Pn is a proportion, a number between 0 and 1, and the population Pn is the nth generation, right? So Pn is the population in the nth generation, and the K here is it constant? That would be different in different situations, perhaps for different species or different environmental conditions. So the bigger K is, the faster the growth rate generally, and we'll be modifying K in several scenarios. So just as Fibonacci had a question, which was how many bunnies after 1 year, my question will not be a specific number after any given amount of time, but what is the long-term population after many generations? So I'm going to describe several scenarios. I think I have 4 scenarios here using this population model. So say we start with an initial condition, an initial population of 0.2, and I'm going to use K equals 2.5. So K is this positive constant. When K equals 2.5, we can start with P1 equals 20% or 0.2, and we can just start calculating what happens in the second generation. We put the numbers into our equation, and don't worry if you don't have to do the arithmetic, or you can tell me if you think it's correct, but you don't have to calculate these. But P2 is 0.4 or 40%. And in the third generation, the population rises to 60%. And here are 10 population figures, the first 10 population figures. So once we get to 0.6, that number just repeats. We put 0.6 back in as our nth population value, and we get the n plus first is still 0.6. So it just continues like that. So you might ask, what happens if I change the population, the initial population? Instead of 0.2, what if I change it to 0.1? We have to be careful because we saw what happened with that pendulum. But not to worry, because when we have 0.1, we go through the calculations and, well, it definitely looks a bit different, right? We're not ending up with 0.6, but let's look carefully. First generation, 22.5%. That should be P2. Second generation is 22.5. Third generation is 43%. Next generation, fourth generation, 61%. And here are the first 10 generations in the population. It doesn't get to 0.6, but it hovers around it very closely, 0.61, 0.59, 0.60, 0.598. It's really very similar. It's coming, the long-term behavior is very much like, very similar to the first scenario. So it didn't really make a difference if I changed that initial condition. Sorry for this wall of numbers. But I skipped over, I just said, let's raise that constant, that K, to 3.4. Remember, we were at 2.5, but now we're jumping up to 3.4, a higher rate of growth, starting with initial condition 0.1, and we've got this wall of numbers. I did not compute these by hand, but we can start to see a pattern, especially towards the end. If you start to look at the last few numbers, now I've colored every second number in purple, and there is a repetition. So, the population, this is like the 100th generation. So once we get into the 90s, where we have a population of 84%, then we fall back to 45%, then back up to 84%, down to 45%, and it cycles between these two values. This is called a cycle. This is quite strange. We just increased the birth rate. We thought maybe we'd get more than 60%. Well, we've got something above and something below. So, all right, so here's my fourth and final scenario. Is change K to 3.5. Instead of presenting you with a wall of 100 numbers, I have just looked at the first 10 and then the last 12 going up to the 100th generation. And the way they're organized, can you see there's a repetition there? Not just we're not repeating every second number, but we're repeating every fourth number. So the population goes from 50% to 87% to 38% to 82%, cycles, and then cycles back through again. And you might think this is very strange. What are these mathematicians doing? This couldn't really happen in nature, but these are really observed. For example, I have a paper I read recently on flower beetles, and if the conditions are right, they really do behave like this, and many other, it's not restricted to one species. So this really does happen in nature. So, I could continue and continue to increase K. When K gets to 3.57, we actually get an 8 cycle, 8 numbers are repeated. And when we increase K a little further, we can even get 16 numbers that start to be repeated. And that's summarized on this diagram. So I'm plotting the eventual population on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis, I've got K, the growth rate. So the 2.5 is off here, but here's the 3.5, and there's my 2 cycle, the 85% and the 84% and 45%. It's how the population oscillates between these two values. At K equals 3.5, we cycle among these 4 values, and I alluded to what happens when K is 3.57, we would get 8 numbers, and when K is a little bit higher, we get 16 numbers, 16 cycle. And here's a much more refined version of that diagram. So there's a lot going on here, but we just looked at, K equals 3.4, here it is. There are my 2 numbers, the 45% and the 84%. If I increase K a little bit more, I will also get a 2 cycle, just slightly different. And so here are all the possible K values, and sometimes this is a phenomenon that occurs in different physical situations, electrical diodes or a dripping faucet even, where there's a doubling effect. So we're increasing the growth rate here, and we go from a 2 cycle, we suddenly jump to a 4 cycle at one point, and then we jump to an 8 cycle, and the 16 cycle, the diagram's a bit too dense for you to see that, And if we go further out, if we get k large enough, we suddenly get what's called chaotic behavior, which you saw a little bit about with the chaotic pendulum. So if I were over here, if I changed my initial condition from 0.1 to 0.2, I would in fact get very different behaviors. So here, this diagram does encode the butterfly effect. So there's a fundamental constant encoded in this diagram. I have this one very specific equation, but I could modify the equation and similar things would happen. But to explore this, let's look at the distance between the doublings. So I'm going to measure D1 as pay special attention to when k equals 3, we suddenly started getting these 2 cycles. When k equals 3.5, we suddenly jump to the 4 cycles, and then we jump to the 8 cycles. And we can measure these distances, these separations between the doublings. And so D1's the separation between the leading up to the to the 2 cycle going to a 4 cycle, and D2 is the distance from the 4 cycle to the 8 cycle in terms of the parameter k that we changed. And we can start once again to take ratios of the larger distance to the smaller distance, just as we did for Fibonacci, and that can converge to a number, and it does converge to a special number. And that is actually sort of some people call this a fundamental constant of the universe, because it shows up in many, many places. Now, to see D4, I've reported it there. It's actually a little bit hard to see. You have to enlarge this diagram. So just backing up, do you see where the 2 D2s are? I've made an enlarged version of that here, and it's a bit squished out, the scale. But now you can see D3 and D4, and you'll also notice a similarity, right? The original bifurcation diagram picture looks very much like parts of the one you see here. And so that's an example of a fractal, which shows self-similarity on a lot of different scales of magnification, at any different scale of magnification. And so this is how we obtain this special number called the Feigenbaum constant. And once again, there's been books written about this constant, and it deserves a lecture, or, for several hours of discussion and reading and cool examples, like the dripping faucet is the one where you might hear this, what's called the period doubling route to chaos, where there'd be a drip, 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 doubling to a drip, 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 then drip, 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 and so on until suddenly a chaotic flow could be heard, perhaps. But I am going to go in a different direction here, and we're now going to look at this diagram not for horizontal separations, but for vertical separations. And this is based on a article from 2006 in a physics journal. And we can actually look at the vertical separations in this diagram. And it turns out that they can be described by 1 divided by different powers of alpha, and alpha is some number. So we're going to look at the heights whenever there's a period doubling, and you can see there's either let's just count how many of those appear. So the lines of length 1 over alpha 1, there's just one of them here. But if we look at the lines of length 1 over alpha squared, there's one here, and there's another one over here. So they're the same length, and so we can record them. And 1 over alpha cubed is here, and also here, and one more over here. So there's actually 3 of them, and they're born in a similar way to the Fibonacci's rabbits. So we've actually recovered the Fibonacci rabbit, or the population of Fibonacci rabbits here when we count same size vertical separations of these doubling distances. All right. So I will leave you with a couple of generalizations. We can change the rule one more time. I promised you 3 equations. I'm not sure if I promised them, but anyway, here's the 3rd equation. And instead of a multiplicative constant, there's an additive constant here, C, that we can change. And the bifurcation diagram over here It looks a little bit different when we square and add a constant, but it has similarities. And if we were to measure the period doublings, we would still use the Feigenbaum constant to see the spacings between those jumps, and the vertical separations between doublings would also still be measured by the Fibonacci frequency, the Fibonacci numbers again. And we can use our new rule with complex numbers. I'm not sure what population we interpret from complex numbers, but they do make a pretty picture when we draw them. And yes, so that actually ends up being a fixed point. And finally, the famous Mandelbrot set is a fractal that you might have seen, and it's actually made from this rule, and it's really a giant higher dimensional bifurcation diagram. You can see how it matches up exactly with the bifurcation diagram that we looked at. So it's not too complicated, and I'll tell anybody who wants to know more later if you would like to discuss this. Thank you. And Robert Bruce will now return to the stage.
Quiz on Monday. S. Christie stepped on a baldosa floja as she walked down Guatemala Street towards the bookstore. She had just learned the phrase, baldosa floja, from the guidebook she had purchased upon arriving in Ezeiza Airport. It meant loose tile. The vocabulary came paired with a warning. The loose tiles that paved the Buenos Aires sidewalks burped dirty water on the legs of unscrupulous pedestrians who didn't understand the intricate particularities of walking in this city. As Christie swiveled her leg to see brown liquid dripping down her calf onto the clean white socks that poked out of her combat boots. As Christie was going to a talk by a British author at an English-language bookstore in San Telmo, a tango neighborhood with lots of interesting bars that S. Christie made a mental note to dip into afterwards. She had seen the talk advertised on the corkboard of a hostel she had stepped into earlier that day to escape the rainstorm that had charged the baldosas flojas with the water that would squirt onto S. Christie's leg as she strode to the bookstore a few hours later. The flyer was handwritten with Sharpie on an orange sheet of construction paper. It read, "Find out how the beating of a butterfly's wings in the Amazon can cause a tornado in Texas, with Dermot Melvin, author of the bestseller Temptress Entropy, at the Walrus Bookstore." As Christie had taken out the small notebook her mother had given her to record the minutiae of her travels and jotted down the address of the bookstore, it struck her as fantastical, the idea of an Amazonian butterfly creating a tornado in Texas. But as she was in South America and her family lived in Kansas, at the very center of Tornado Alley, the concept also felt somewhat threatening on a personal level. She resolved to attend the talk. When S. Christie arrived at the bookstore, she saw that she was one of just 2 attendees. A makeshift bar was set up by the desk in the doorway. S. Christie accepted a small glass of Malbec from a young woman in a black button-down, unsure whether to persist with her slow but assured Spanish when she knew the woman must speak English. "Gracias," she decided, lifting the wine in a pert toast. "De nada," the woman responded warmly, giving S. Christie a look of kind complicity. The bookstore was dark and musty, all red drapes and mahogany bookshelves lined with shabby second-hand books. "Please," the young woman said, touching S. Christie's arm, "have a seat." S. Christie moved to the 3rd row of plastic folding chairs. A total of 10 chairs were set up in uneven rows before a haggard-looking podium. The other attendee was a man slumped in the front row. His brown hair fell in curtains around his face. He appeared to be sleeping. The young woman approached him cautiously, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, the talk will be starting now." The man lifted his head with a jolt. "Of course," he said. The man stood up, shaking his head slightly, and proceeded to the podium. He shielded his eyes sarcastically as he surveyed his meager audience. "Well," he began, "glad to see such a good turnout. Must have forgotten to post those flyers around town, eh, Vivian? The young woman in black had taken her seat at the far end of the second row. I assure you I did, she responded evenly, and my name is Viviana. The man waved a hand airily, unconcerned. Never mind, he said. My ferry to Montevideo leaves in a few hours, so let's get on with it, shall we? As Christie sat up straight, pen poised above her notebook. My name, as no doubt you saw on the flyers our dear Mademoiselle Viviana posted in the area, the man began, is Dermot Melvin. I'm a novelist, but more importantly, I'm a thinker. And today I'm here to talk to you about one of the things I've contemplated the most in my life. Dermot paused for dramatic effect, then went on, it's called the chaos theory, but you may know it as the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect, as Christie noted the title at the top of the page, underlining it with an assured stroke of her pen. Dermot cleared his throat. We're going to touch on a number of topics in this lecture, he said, and I hope that you can follow along. Number of topics, as Christie wrote in her neat shorthand. Follow along. In 1963, a meteorologist named Edward Lorenz began to study the effect of tiny variations in predictive models producing massively different long-term outcomes. Tiny variations, as Christie jotted down, different outcomes. She looked down at her notes and then added, 1963. Take a butterfly, Dermot said. A single butterfly fluttering its wings in the Amazon. Insignificant enough. Butterfly fluttering, as Christie wrote. Amazon insignificant. Yet imagine, Dermot continued, that in the flapping of its tiny wings, the butterfly sets off another minuscule phenomenon, say, a nearly imperceptible temperature change, which in turn triggers a larger phenomenon. Eventually, those phenomena all build up to a large weather event, the tornado in Texas, if you will. Not so insignificant after all. As Christie looked down at her notes, her handwriting had begun to break down as she struggled to keep up. Flapping, tiny, trigger, large, Texas. She pressed her lips together with slight frustration and raised her eyes back to Dermot, who ran a hand through his hair before he went on. Lorenz found that the margins in predictive models were so strict that the smallest of differences could produce virtually opposite results. While his findings were originally meant to apply to the world of meteorology, Lorenz's so-called chaos theory caused a stir in the scientific world. Now it is used in every field of study that involves predictions. Dermot finally paused and locked eyes with S. Christie briefly. Lost yet? He said. As Christie reached for her Malbec self-consciously, cheeks burning. I have a question, Viviana suddenly said, raising her hand slightly from the end of her row. Dermot raised his eyebrows. Yes, he said. Don't you believe, Viviana said, that deterministic chaos would apply whether or not a butterfly flapped its wings? Dermot cocked his head slightly. Of course, he responded. Chaos theory constitutes the complete breakdown of causal relationships. Butterfly or no butterfly, deterministic chaos applies. But that is not a breakdown of causal relationships at all, the woman said. It is simply a dictum by which to understand the butterfly. Chaos grows exponentially no matter what you do. The butterfly is simply a tool to understand the effect, Dermot responded, sighing impatiently. Let's not belabor the point. With all due respect, Viviana responded, you wrote a novel on the subject. Dermot stared at her. As Christie looked from the storm gathering on Dermot's brow to Viviana, whose face was alight with some wild species of excitement, she capped her pen and folded her hands in her lap. To this, she would simply have to listen. Well, yes, Dermot finally said. I suppose I did. Then let me rephrase my question, Viviana said, sitting up somewhat taller in her chair. Do you think that you can predict a butterfly? Excuse me? Dermot said. A small mocking smile seemed to play around his lips once more. I don't think I understand the question. Viviana lifted her chin. Do you think, she repeated slowly, that you can predict a butterfly? Dermot's smile began to fade. Look, he said, I don't know what you're getting at, but if you don't mind, in Temptress Entropy, Viviana cut him off, your female characters are all agents of chaos. Well, the Temptress certainly is, Dermot responded. You can glean that just from the title. Right, Viviana said, and the protagonist is an author, similar to yourself, she went on, who must keep the woman from destroying a small artifact that holds the meaning of life. That's right, Dermot said. And isn't the Temptress, in the end, presented as the very personification of chaos, of randomness, of entropy, as you write in your title? And yet, somehow, her foil is a man who represents, what? The arrow of time? Look, Dermot said irritably, Viviana, the woman snapped. Viviana, look, it's fiction. Dermot's breathing was slightly heavy now. So you could really cut me a break. Viviana smirked slightly. Now, if you don't mind, I'll return to our audience. Dermot cast his frenzied eyes to S. Christie, who sat riveted by the exchange. Any questions, he asked? S. Christie reeled slightly backwards in her folding chair. Oh, she said, I know, I just... Did you follow the lecture, he said? S. Christie stammered. The real question, Viviana cut in, is whether you understand what you are saying, Mr. Melvin. Of course I do, Dermot blustered. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Viviana said coolly. You misunderstood the butterfly in your own novel. What? Dermot was leaning over the podium now, staring at Viviana with something like hate. Viviana's nostrils flared. Clearly, the Temptress was never a deviation. She was not a fractal. The Temptress was no butterfly. Then what was she? Dermot roared, frustrated. What was she then? Tell me. Viviana shook her head, her eyes narrow. Don't you see? She laughed derisively. The Temptress was the tornado. Dermot stood, speechless for a moment. As Christie watched his eyes grow big and his lips silently form the words, the Temptress was the tornado. For a moment, a smile spread across Dermot's red face. Then he remembered where he was. Dermot's lip curled and he glared at Viviana, who was watching him with a mix of contempt and pity. I don't have to take this, he snarled. Viviana smiled placidly as Dermot grabbed his jacket, pushing several plastic chairs aside as he stormed to the front of the bookstore. He threw open the door and strode outside, not bothering to pull it closed behind him. Almost immediately upon exiting, Dermot Melvin stepped on one of Buenos Aires' infamous loose tiles, which squirted steaming brown water up his pant leg. With a bellow of frustration, the author stomped away. Baldosa floja, as Christie whispered. Viviana looked over at her approvingly. Muy bien, she said. You already know to avoid the loose tiles in this city. Yes, as Christie responded, smiling slightly. They're one of a few things you can count on here, Viviana responded. That and the fragile ego of a man. One little question, and suddenly, chaos. As Christie pulled out her notebook to make one last note of what she had learned that day. Question, chaos. Man, fragile. Watch where you step. And now please welcome to the stage Janet Johnson, the artistic director of Ormao Dance Company.
Pineapple, anyone? We have had the great privilege of creating space for many collaborations with a myriad of artists, from music to visual artists and everything in between. Over the 34 years, we have had the great opportunity to perform in lots of different traditional theatrical spaces, including the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center, the Pikes Peak Center, the Lincoln Center in Fort Collins, the Takaw Performing Arts Center in Basalt, Colorado, and, of course, the Ent Center for the Arts. During this time, we have also developed a reputation for showing up in unusual places, unexpected places, and we've created original work that is relevant to that particular location. From the construction zone between Colorado Springs and Manitou Springs, the vacant Gazette building. We also activated a lot of spaces outside the studios at Ormao in the downtown area during the pandemic, which includes the cul-de-sac, the alley, the loading dock. Here we are in the basement of the Carter Payne Chapel, and activating the new art space to be at the corner of Costilla and Wasatch, and the Concrete Coyote Art Park. But never have our dancers been asked to create and paint while dancing. So this project really offered us a unique opportunity. An opportunity for Ormao Dance Company to create something through the eyes, the heart, and the mind of this award-winning artist, Karen Mosbacher. Collaboratively, Karen invited us into her vision, and it started with the background of the butterfly effect, the Fibonacci series, all the things that you've been learning about tonight. She shared her previous experience with composer Ofer Ben-Amots, and we experienced her way of seeing and painting music. Mind's blown. Where do we start? Okay, dancers discussed ideas about how butterflies move. What are movement qualities of butterflies? How about whirling tornadoes? How about chaos? How can we embody those things? So we jumped into white painter suits, and they had to learn how to paint with a variety of tools, thanks to Karen. They had to also listen to the musical composition by Ofer Ben-Amots. They had to know that. They have to keep in mind Karen's original painting and composition, as well as definitely the colors that she sees. And they had to dance with the dance composition and all the movement qualities that we discussed. So all of these things coming together. The complexity of those mind-body connections that the dancers are going through tonight cannot be overly emphasized. Dancers create by moving with emotion. Truly, moving with energy, with motion. So I'd like to invite Karen back to the stage here before we wrap up the evening.
Do you ever wonder how things are made? You are about to see this dream come true. Are you curious about what happened to make it so? Well, let's take a short trip to the making of the butterfly effect, experimenting with expression. First, we drew a picture of the dream, wrote a thing about what we were going to do. Then we began designing, sawing, and sawing, measuring, squatting, securing, threading, sewing, shoving, pulling, painting, and painting, and painting, and painting, and painting. Are you tired yet? Then we did some drilling, stapling, twisting, wrapping, drying, and some silly goofing and laughing when things worked. Then the dancers did some thinking, waiting, stretching, moving, improvising, worrying a little bit. And the crew did some clowning around and repairing. And the moment came when the dancers were willing and listening. And then we came to the beginning again and started over and did it all together. I am extremely honored and very excited to introduce 5 dancers from the Ormao Dance Company. Please welcome Jordan McHenry, AJ Winkler, Claire Zavislin, Mary Ripper Baker, and Britt Ford, performing the butterfly effect, experimenting with expression.
On behalf, I'd like to speak on behalf of Karen and the entire creative team here. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And please go out and imagine all of these things that you've learned tonight. And if you have any burning questions that you would like to ask any of the speakers or the dancers, please feel free to come down to the stage before you leave. Or if you are going to go home and dream about this, enjoy your evening. And thank you so much.